Alfred Hitchcock, infamous English film director and producer, and also master of suspense, once commented about the artistic strides directors and producers make in order to create a meaningful and box office hit, saying, "I am less interested in telling stories rather than in the matter of telling them. There is a way of telling a story through a cinematic medium that can make the audience relate to situations in the film or display time period related events. The possibilities to depict narratives in cinematic form are endless. Ways in which the audience interprets those depictions are at the audience's discretion, which makes the art of cinema such a viable art form, especially during the early years of film, precisely during the 1920s to the 1940s. Both the United States and Europe became hubs for cinematic production, always in competition with one another. The films were a great way of escape for most during the times of the Great Depression and all throughout wartime. A great deal of labor goes into making a film during the pre-production, production, and post-production stages. Once the components for creating a film were available to do so, it was all a matter of who became successful in the end. All production aspects changed to a certain degree, but post-production changed the most in terms of editing, sound, color, etc. This matters because moviegoers were looking for escapes after the war, and the culture had developed into one of rapid mass consumption. So these new post-production techniques were a way to keep up with their ever-changing happenings in society while keeping the audience entertained and distracted.
In the 1920s, across the entire world, since sound was being introduced, this caused a great deal of frustration for actors.
Warner Brothers would be the first company to integrate sound with cinema. Their first endeavor was a 5-piece jazz band to play the music. During the 1920s, there was not really much of any engineering purposes or script writing, since the sound was added at a later time in development. A storyboard was there to help visualize and also detrimental to the plot line of the film. Investors could also see what they were getting themselves into.
In the 1930s was the decade that films would see iconic stars and marked the golden age of Hollywood.
Talkies were invented during the time of the 1930s. In the United States and Europe, actors are so accustomed to not having to deal with sound in films that this made it harder for actors to transition into films using the aspect of sound. With the element of sound being added, this made available to the scriptwriter to have dialogue cast in the film for the actors. According to the American film industry, experienced actors had to obtain voice lessons as they were going to be speaking their roles. Engineers prepared the studios to coordinate the sound with emotions. It was complete and utter chaos. Writers flocked to Hollywood.
During the 1940s, it wasn't a promising time for film. Actors were enlisted in the war, and this made it very difficult for directors to have a full-blown cast. And even for markets across the whole world, this is making it difficult to sell films.
Stemming from the talkies was the musical era of the 1940s. Films that resembled Broadway shows were looking to be produced and written. Scriptwriters had a secured job writing scripts for the films since the invention of talkies. Storyboards were a great way to line up shots and camera movements, since the camera movement was available and alive.
They still say I love you, on that you can rely.
After the pre-production of a movie comes the actual filming, known as one might expect as production.
According to LaVideoFilmmaker.com, production includes principal photography, rehearsal, setting up and taking the shots, and checking the take. While production took a huge leap in technique and filming styles from the earliest films to those of the 20s, not much changed during the span of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Filmmakers had apparently found a production style that worked, and they decided to stick with it.
And that style included more than just the use of panning and close-ups.
A good example to begin with would be Sergei Eisenstein's work on the 1925 USSR film Battleship Potemkin.
While Eisenstein is most noted for his work with editing and the montage that editing produced, many of the shots in the film could not have been accomplished by editing alone. They were the result of careful camera setup while on the set.
According to A.R. Fulton, author of Motion Pictures, The Development of an Art, there is hardly a shot in the film that is not carefully composed.
The sailors' hammocks form a variety of geometric patterns. A ship's grating casts a checkered shadow on a sailor's face, emphasized by a close-up. The opening of a tent through which the camera photographs the harbor masks the shot triangularly. The film is brought to a close as the great bow of the ship comes directly head-on until it blacks out the screen. Additionally, says Fulton, Eisenstein was a master not only in directing crowd scenes, but in moving groups of people and studied composition, setting up the camera to show crowds moving in multiple directions for a single shot, or using the ship's railings as natural split screens. Later filmmakers used similar techniques. The crowd scenes throughout the 1936 U.S. film Modern Times, especially the one in the diner, had to be carefully set up to produce the desired shot, with everyone moving in the right directions and with no one crashing into the camera. In the 1947 German film The Murderers Are Among Us, the camera and lighting was set up in such a way to make Dr. Hans Merton's shadow completely envelop Ferdinand Bruckner, something that was likely not done in post-production. The trick had to be successfully implemented during the actual filming.
Between the years of 1915 and 1928, films were recorded in black and white. Since the technology to film in color had not yet been invented, color was artificially added in multiple different techniques. Each of the individual images were either tinted, toned, or hand-colored to capture the viewer's attention and make everything seem more interesting.
This was often a tedious task and required certain individuals for the job that had the skill to do so.
By 1920, tinting became the norm, as 80% of films used this technique.
Beginning in the early 1920s, footage was immediately screened by the director and editor after the first day of filming.
The relationship between the director and editor, or cutter, was extremely important. That being said, the director relied heavily on the cutter to form his vision.
As the film was manually cut and spliced together, the individuals would review the shots from the day and dish out those which no longer had any chance of being used. Screening cut down the time it took to put the film together when it got to that point after filming was finished.
With the ability to add sound to films, a whole new door was opened to the world of cinema. As sound was originally added after the film was shot, the need to have sound editors became very prominent. Paramount was the first major motion picture company to hire a designated team of sound editors.
The early attempts of adding sound to film while recording proved to not be very successful, which is why post-scoring became the standard way to add music and sound to the film. Before 1931, individuals relied heavily on a synchronizer, which kept multiple camera picture film in sync during editing. However, this system did not allow editors to hear dialogue simultaneously with the picture. This made it extremely difficult to edit sound along with multiple camera shots. Although in 1931, the sound mi viola was introduced, and by 1932, edge numbering each shot was a standard practice, with synchronization becoming less of a problem. A new, quick cut and rapid fire dialogue style of editing emerged.
Edward McDermott is famous for the style of editing from the film The Public Enemy. A study was done which showed that from 1928 to 1933, the average shot length out of 70 American films was 11 seconds.
From 1934 to 1939, the average shot length of 130 films went down to 9 seconds.
This proves that the coming of sound changed and evolved the way films were made.
Soviet filmmakers, such as Sergei Eisenstein and multiple others, can also be viewed as pioneers of this quick-cut editing. These individuals created a different feel in their films since they had a political commentary.
However, they were very influential in the way their editing was artistically expressed. Although sound did seem to play a slight disadvantage in more poor countries like Russia. Since new technology and equipment was necessary for sound to be implemented, some studios could not afford to do this. This put them at a great disadvantage to the studios already working with sound, and many times put them out of business.
As we can see, post-production was the most detrimental stage to determine a film's success during the golden ages, etc. of the 1920s to the 40s. Without a production staff to secure shots and put the film together, the whole production would still be stuck at limbo in the production stage. The actors in compiling shots for the film were extremely important and changed over time to a certain degree. However, it was post-production that saw the biggest change and the biggest struggles to keep up with the times and the ever-changing advances that were seen in society and the industry.